I love Christopher Nolan movies, and I'm a sucker for time travel movies. So Tenet was basically a dream come true for me when it came out over 5 years ago now. But after watching it again recently, I sadly have to admit that, well, it's not that good. I remember the first time I watched it and thinking to myself afterwards, none of this makes any sense, and well, in hindsight, I was right. As I usually am, of course, yes. The entire narrative of Tenet kinda takes a backseat to the concept and Nolan's out of order storytelling that he goes for here, which I don't necessarily hate, by the way, because at least the concept is unique, but I do think that the entire movie really suffers from it in the end. Which brings me to my first big problem with Tenet, the characters. Throughout the entire runtime, I never feel like any of the characters have any arcs whatsoever, which is kind of a classic criticism I have for many action movies, but my god, all of them are so bland here. John David Washington, who plays the protagonist, basically does his absolute best to not produce any facial expressions or show any emotion in his voice. Despite the fact that I think Robert Pattinson is an excellent actor, his character Neil is written to be just another mysterious stoic who's good at literally everything. He doesn't undergo any development or arc throughout the entire movie. They also make him reference as many scientific concepts as possible, even when it makes absolutely no sense for him to do so, but rather only contributes to the confusingly written dialogue. There's also Laura, a scientist played by Clémence Poésy, who only appears in the opening to deliver some exposition to the protagonist. But this is one of the worst written scenes in the entire film, in my opinion. Basically, the first thing she says is that they can't talk about what the Tenet organization does, and literally 10 seconds later she explains that they're trying to prevent World War III, and that she's a scientist who researches objects whose entropy has been inverted, causing them to flow through time backwards. I mean, sure, it's not like she's giving away a lot of details, but she's literally saying as much about what they do as she could possibly know. The real reason that this scene is bad, though, is because it makes perfectly clear what this movie is going to be: unnecessarily confusing. This is also my personal biggest gripe with Tenet. Laura is written to be as vague, mysterious, and unclear about everything as possibly imaginable, and I don't know why anyone thought that was a good idea when she's literally only there to explain what's going to be happening in the rest of the film. She's by no means the only character like this, though. It feels like everyone in the movie is speaking in riddles and you have to decipher what they're trying to say in real time. When the protagonist tries to pick up an inverted bullet and it doesn't work, she tells him that he has to pick it up first. He then succeeds in doing so, and as a viewer we are really left guessing what he just did differently than before, especially considering that this is basically the first time that we see inverted objects being interacted with. It's a really bad way to set the premise. It only gets worse after she tells him not to try and understand the logic behind it, but rather to just feel it using his intuition. And as an audience member, you're feeling it too. The absolute confusion about what you're watching right now. The two then have a conversation about free will and cause and effect. Laura claims that cause and effect is not real and only exists because of the way we perceive time. And free will is real because he picked up that bullet, saying, "You made that happen." The irony here could only be more blatant if her line had been, "You caused that effect." She's also wrong about free will, by the way, which I'll talk about later. For some reason, the protagonist also acts like he's shocked to learn that he's catching the bullets rather than shooting them, even though they just talked about inverted bullets for like half an hour, and John Washington delivers a masterclass in appearing mildly surprised.
I'm catching it.
Whoa.
The main problem in this exposition scene is that all the dialogue sounds like it was meticulously engineered to confuse the viewer, which is basically going to keep happening every single time in the film when someone opens their mouth, but is extremely stupid this time, considering it's supposed to give you an idea of what's about to come. By the way, something that doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the movie, but I found very amusing nonetheless, is that in one scene, the nameless protagonist is on a phone call and says he needs help to get to Sanjay Singh in Mumbai. This is like going to New York and asking about John Smith. The first, "I ordered my hot sauce an hour ago" fight scene is also just okay. I didn't really expect anything from it, but it's also not incredible. I guess the usage of the environment is kinda nice, beating a guy up with a cheese grater, but nothing too crazy. The next fight scene that we see at the airport in Norway is really cool, however, where we see Neil and the protagonist fighting their inverted selves. I think a lot of the choreography in this film is heavily elevated by using the time inversion concept, which I really liked. But after winning the fight from his perspective, the protagonist asks, "Who are you?" rather than pulling off his mask, which would generally be helpful if you wanted to figure out someone's identity. But for plot reasons, he's not allowed to know who it is yet. A lot of the story elements come together seemingly out of nowhere and are once again designed to be maximally confusing, like the Goya painting, which was a fake, but they were actually two fakes, and they were forged by Thomas Arepo, who is completely irrelevant to the rest of the story, except for having been in a relationship with Kat, apparently, and the paintings were authenticated by Kat and then sold to her husband, Andrei Sator, for $9 million, who is now using it as blackmail against her to stay with him against her will. And all of this is revealed in 5 minutes of clunky expository dialogue. The entire Freeport mission is also very confusing and not well set up at all. The reason the protagonist even knows about the Freeports in the first place is because he said he would destroy the painting that Sator is using to control Kat. But when he's talking to Neil about their plan, he starts mentioning radioactive material for some reason, and Michael Caine, who literally only appears once in the entire film, didn't say anything about the Freeports, or what the protagonist is even supposed to do about Sator either. Even after watching the airport mission, it's still unclear what the point of it even was, since they don't take, nor destroy, nor inspect anything at all. And I get that the protagonist telling Neil to look out for radioactivity is supposed to be in reference to inverted objects, but this radioactivity is also just only kind of mentioned very briefly by Laura in the beginning and is completely irrelevant up until now. So once again, the entire thing couldn't have been set up in a more messy, convoluted way than it was, and that's all without the time inversion mechanics. Priya tells the protagonist about turnstiles and we then see the car chase for the first time. Obviously, you mostly don't know what's really going on because some of the cars are moving in reverse, but overall this scene is really interesting, and one of the first times we really get to see the inversion mechanics in action, which is great. Sadly, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm going to get to that later when I talk about the actual time travel. We then see the interrogation scene, and again, the only way you understand what's going on here when you're watching it for the first time is if you convince yourself that you do. First, we see the interrogation from the protagonist's point of view. Then we see Sator going through the turnstile and actually do the interrogation. As opposed to the car scene, which is kind of supposed to be unclear at first, this scene is meant to demonstrate how turnstiles and time inversion actually function. First off, the turnstiles invert the time polarities, so to speak, of whoever goes through them, while not transporting them into the past like a regular time machine would, despite the confusing dialogue seemingly indicating that.
Where did he go?
Past.
Can he stabilize the inverse radiation by inverting the patient?
Takes days. We took control of this machine minutes ago. Before that, it's Sator's.
3 hour steps. Find another machine.
A week ago, where?
It wasn't last week.
Secondly, if you invert yourself and do something in the past, it will have already happened at that point in time before you inverted yourself. This second rule is what I'm going to use to argue the point about free will, which I mentioned earlier, and is also why most contradictions here happen. Precisely, the protagonist tells Sator that he already told the inverted Sator where the plutonium is. After this, forward Sator knows that no matter what he does after inverting himself, the protagonist will tell him the information that he's asking about, even before ever conducting the interrogation. So according to the film's own rules, this is a deterministic universe, which directly means that there's no free will. Laura really went 0 for 2. The next big issue I have with the film is the internal consistency and logic of the time inversion concept. In the same scene that I just discussed, if the protagonist had instead ended up not telling Sator where he put the plutonium, Sator would walk through the turnstile already knowing that he's not going to get the answer that he's looking for, meaning that he wouldn't have any reason to interrogate the protagonist in the first place. But if he then doesn't interrogate him, he wouldn't know whether or not the protagonist was going to tell him where the plutonium is, meaning that he would then choose to interrogate him, which is clearly paradoxical. The reason I'm mentioning this is just to show how easy it is to trigger a paradox under this concept. Also, there are multiple different times throughout the movie where this exact same paradox could appear, by the way, including the final battle, which I'll get to later. After Neil and the protagonist go through the turnstile, the protagonist says he wants to prevent Sator from killing Kat in the past, and Neil, who is supposed to be knowledgeable on time inversion, says that the effects of Kat being killed in the past are unknowable, which is just blatantly false. The fact that Kat is still alive in the present already confirms that Sator doesn't kill her in the past, using the second rule from earlier in the entire free will thing. This is also why the grandfather paradox does not apply in this universe, even though they really try to make it seem like it does. Then we see the entire car chase scene again, this time from the perspective of the inverted protagonist, which is absolutely atrocious. It makes absolutely no sense in the slightest and ends in a very questionable car explosion. I mean, first off, Wheeler says that when you are inverted, proximity to fire will basically end up in you freezing and ice developing on your clothing rather than you feeling warmer, and she explains it by saying that heat transfer is reversed. I have absolutely no clue why Nolan decided to implement this or why he thought that this makes any sense whatsoever. If heat transfer is reversed, then you would first gain heat from reversed cold convection through the air, which is normally what dissipates the heat from your body when you step away from fire. You would then reverse radiate this excess heat energy back to the fire continuously while exiting the proximity of the heat source, aka fire would just be regularly reversed like everything else is. I genuinely don't know why they had to add this extra rule about ice, which is just blatant nonsense, especially when there are explosions caused by inverted weapons in the final battle, which should apparently turn Starsk 12 into an ice skating arena. And since people are constantly firing weapons, all the inverted guns should also be useless. And why is there even an explosion if the car is cooling down? We can even see the windows frost up, and why does the car not get blown up by what seems to be a normal explosion? Even disregarding all this, why does Sator not just shoot the protagonist while he's a sitting duck? You should know that there's a good chance the protagonist will survive this car explosion, considering that Sator has had more experience with time inversion than pretty much anyone else, and definitely knows about this inverted heat transfer rule. Sator's entire plan here is also completely stupid, and the movie for some reason doesn't address it at all. How would he possibly be able to get the plutonium when he already knows that at the beginning of the chase, the case is inside of the security truck? So he already knows that eventually the chase will play out the way we already saw, with the protagonist giving the plutonium to his inverted self. If you argue that he just goes back in time further to get the 241, then he would just travel further into the past until he enters a turnstile, which would mean he would have already had the plutonium before the chase, so the chase itself would never have happened in the way it did. Another huge flaw in the story are the temporal pincer movements. Sure, they sound cool and whatnot, but the entire idea of them is to watch an event unfold and to then invert yourself and benefit from having after-the-fact knowledge of the event. This is the most obvious possible violation of Rule 2 because if you go back in time to change something, it already will have happened that way in the first place. So immediately multiple of the big plot points in Tenet contradict the inversion logic. The worst example of this is in the final battle where the red team briefing uses information that was acquired by blue team who already know the outcome of the battle. If red team uses this information about what they could improve and subsequently adapt their strategy, which it seems like they are, then blue team would never even have been able to tell them to make these improvements since they already have. This then also means that red team would not receive said information about what they did wrong and thus would be unable to adapt their strategy, leading to the exact same paradox from early in the interrogation scene. Another somewhat inconsequential quirk of time inversion is the entire cloning problem. It's very simple. If you go through a turnstile twice, you're basically a duplicate, and if you wait long enough between turnstile uses, you can create arbitrarily many versions of yourself at one point in time by doing this. This even happens multiple times in the movie where there are multiple forwards versions of the same person, but the film never mentions this for some reason, but whatever. After the car chase, Neil explains the algorithm to Kat and the protagonist and says that if it is activated, everything we know will be destroyed. Kat then asks,
Including my son.
which is just laughable for obvious reasons. The protagonist then explains to the audience why this movie can't logically have a bad ending for the main cast, since the antagonists from the future want to intertwine the two directions of time, which obviously hasn't happened yet, meaning it will never be able to happen. Neil then says, and I quote, "In a parallel worlds theory, we can't know the relationship between consciousness and multiple realities. This just means absolutely nothing, even from a pessimistic viewpoint, which he claims that this is. How does consciousness and multiple realities have anything to do with anything? All of this is physically happening, in one reality. This is just, again, there to confuse the audience and make the entire story seem more complex than it really is. Even if there were multiple realities in this hypothetical multiverse, that doesn't change that in this reality, they necessarily have to win." Neil then explains the grandfather paradox to the protagonist, who then tries to shoot a former version of himself in the very next scene. This is just dumb. I've heard people trying to defend this scene by saying that he's missing on purpose, but that's really far-fetched in my opinion, because he's literally pointing the gun at head height, and unless he fully remembers every detail of this fight, is relying on his past self to dodge and flinch in a way that he doesn't one-tap himself. As for the finale, I've already talked about why it doesn't make sense from a logical standpoint, but I also think that the story here leaves a couple of things unexplained again, such as why they need to detonate the bomb or Neil's death. As for the bomb, the reason they needed to blow up is so that Sator thinks his plan actually worked out and he doesn't become suspicious of Tenet taking the algorithm. None of this is explained, however, and there is in fact no explanation of why the bomb has to detonate at all within the actual film. You just have to piece it together yourself, and I would wager that there are many people who saw this film and didn't even understand that Neil dies at the end by getting shot in the head by Volkov, because we see Neil leaving the landing zone at the end. I mean, he does say that it's the end of the road for him, but I still think that many people might not realize that even though you can clone yourself, you only get one death, because the version of you that dies will always be the quote-unquote latest version of yourself. And all other versions of you will eventually die in the same way. The finale doesn't really make sense, but the avalanche of plot twists and reveals explain a lot of narrative questions, and I actually think serves as a satisfying conclusion to this massive, messy blob of a narrative. The film is consistently thrilling, keeps up a constant tension, and looks really great visually. The concept of time inversion is implemented in unique and unexpected ways and never turns stale throughout the entire runtime. Part of why watching the movie is enjoyable is because it works like a journey for you to connect the dots yourself as you go along, but does so maybe just a little bit too much. The reveals and plot twists are all very effective because it's hard to see them coming when you really have no idea what's going on in the first place. I really like the score for this movie personally, and I don't think anyone disagrees that the sound balancing is terrible and makes some of the dialogue difficult to understand. I think Tenet is often underappreciated for how impactful of a movie it is, considering that I'm sitting here talking about it even over 5 years after its release. I'm also very glad that this movie was made because it shows that there can still be crazy and unique concepts in high-budget, high-profile releases these days. Unfortunately, Tenet is also another entry on the long list of films that demonstrate why time travel is a concept that can literally never work in movies and TV shows. I would even say it's one of the better time travel movies, believe it or not. But in the end, the characters have absolutely no arcs, including Kate. The entire writing and dialogue seems handcrafted to perfection to invoke as much confusion about what you're watching as possible. The movie contradicts itself constantly and ultimately has left me both entertained and incredibly frustrated at the end for both of the times that I've now watched it.